The Siege of Bastogne has, entered military folklore through a single moment. When German forces demanded the surrender of the surrounded American garrison in December of 1944, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, replied with one word: nuts. It became a symbol of defiance, repeated in books and documentaries for decades. But that famous exchange honestly hides a more complicated and revealing truth. The survival of the 101st Airborne inside Bastogne had far less to do with heroic slogans than with a series of improvised survival practices developed under extreme logistical failure. By the time the German encirclement tightened on December 20th, the American defenders faced shortages of artillery shells, winter clothing, medical supplies, and even food. Temperatures dropped below freezing, snow covered the Ardennes forests, vehicles froze overnight, wounded soldiers accumulated in cellars that had once served as town shelters. What allowed the 101st to endure was not simply courage or discipline. It was a combination of practical survival knowledge, battlefield improvisation, and decisions made by small unit leaders who understood that holding Bastogne required more than fighting skill. It required finding ways to keep thousands of soldiers alive while cut off from supply lines. The siege became, honestly, one of the clearest demonstrations in modern warfare that survival logistics, how soldiers stay warm, fed, supplied, and mobile under isolation, can matter just as much as tactics or firepower. One of the first survival lessons came from how the division rapidly reorganized abandoned supply stockpiles. When elements of the 101st Airborne arrived in Bastogne on December 18, 1944, the situation was chaotic. The German Ardennes offensive had already shattered several American positions. Units retreating through Bastogne left behind damaged vehicles, scattered ammunition crates, and partially emptied supply dumps. Rather than ignoring this debris of retreat, officers and non-commissioned officers began consolidating what had been abandoned. Quartermaster personnel gathered loose ammunition, fuel cans, rations, and winter clothing wherever they could find it. Truck depots were searched, field kitchens were reopened, civilian storage buildings were repurposed. What emerged was, really, an improvised logistics system built almost entirely from what had already been left behind. This mattered enormously once German forces completed the encirclement. The supplies collected during those first 48 hours gave the defenders a buffer that delayed the moment when true shortages began. The defenders also survived by learning to conserve artillery ammunition with unusual discipline. American doctrine in World War II relied heavily on artillery firepower. Inside Bastogne, those assumptions collapsed. Artillery units quickly realized their ammunition stocks were limited and that resupply might not come for days. Batteries were ordered to fire only when targets were clearly identified and tactically necessary. Harassing fire and routine bombardment were drastically reduced. Observers became extremely selective. Cold weather survival became just as important as resisting German attacks. Perhaps the most immediate threat to the 101st Airborne was not enemy fire, but the winter itself. The division had been rushed into the Ardennes without adequate winter gear. Many soldiers wore thin uniforms intended for milder conditions. The cold forced units to adapt quickly. Soldiers layered whatever clothing they could find, German coats taken from prisoners, civilian blankets, and captured scarves. Buildings inside Bastogne were converted into temporary warming points, where troops rotated through brief periods of shelter before returning to foxholes. Medical improvisation inside Bastogne became one of the most overlooked survival efforts of the siege. As the siege continued, medical personnel faced an increasingly desperate situation. Hospitals inside Bastogne filled rapidly with wounded soldiers and civilians. Supplies of bandages, plasma, and antibiotics dwindled. Army surgeons began improvising. The defenders also survived by quietly relying on the local Belgian population. The role of Bastogne's civilians rarely receives the attention it deserves. Residents of the town opened their cellars to American soldiers seeking shelter from artillery bombardments. Civilians shared stored food when military rations ran short. Some guided patrols through lesser-known paths in the surrounding forests. Air resupply only succeeded because the defenders had prepared landing zones and distribution plans in advance. For several days during the siege, bad weather prevented Allied aircraft from reaching Bastogne. When the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, the defenders were ready. Units had already identified drop zones outside the town. Panels were laid out to guide aircraft. Teams were assigned to collect parachuted containers immediately and distribute supplies to frontline units. This preparation ensured that the first wave of aerial resupply did not descend into chaos. Within hours, ammunition and medical supplies were reaching the positions that needed them most. Leadership stability helped prevent panic as the encirclement tightened. Despite the sudden German offensive and the encirclement of the town, the command structure of the 101st Airborne remained largely intact. Orders were communicated clearly. Defensive sectors were defined early. Unit commanders knew their responsibilities. The final survival factor was time, holding long enough for external forces to break the siege. Ultimately, no survival technique inside Bastogne could have sustained the defenders indefinitely. Their endurance bought time. General George Patton's Third Army was already maneuvering north to relieve the town. When relief forces finally broke through on December 26th, the siege ended. The real lesson of Bastogne is that survival logistics often decides whether heroic resistance is even possible. Bastogne is remembered as a dramatic stand during the Battle of the Bulge, but the deeper lesson lies beneath the famous moments. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne survived because they adapted to isolation faster than their situation deteriorated. If you value this kind of deeper historical analysis, consider subscribing to Logistics of Survival and share this video with others who want to understand not just what happened in history, but how people managed to endure it.